Li Yuan-chia was a polymath. He was an artist, a poet, an organizer. He was someone who was generous and hospitable to people, who created space for other people's practice, as well as developing his own.
Li Yuan-chia was born in Guangxi province in the heartland of China in 1929, and from there he led one of the most unusual journeys of contemporary art. He was a refugee of the Chinese Civil War and moved to Taiwan in 1949, was part of the Ton Fan group of experimental abstract and ink painters that were active in the 50s. He then moved to Bologna in Italy, and it was from there that he was invited by the artist David Badaya to Signals Gallery in London, where he first showed in 1965, and then finally moved to London in 1966. And then in a sort of a burst of energy and activity, he was showing at Signals, at the newly formed Listen Gallery, and in that time period he accepted an invitation for Christmas, went up to Cumbria for Christmas in 1967 and stayed there for the rest of his life. He went on to purchase an old dilapidated farm building from the modernist painter Winifred Nicholson and converted that into the LYC, the initials of his name, Museum and Art Gallery.
The LYC Museum and Art Gallery was a space run by the artist Li Yuan-chia in Cumbria between 1972 and 1983. It was a site where Li organised exhibitions of artists of all kinds, of all ages, at all stages of their career, and even people who wouldn't have identified as an artist in their everyday lives.
The LYC Museum and Art Gallery is pretty difficult to describe because I think it was and is quite unique. It was a gallery, but it was also a space that invited people in to organise performances, poetry readings, a space that also provided shelter for people as they were walking along Hadrian's Wall. And it was a visitor attraction, so people often just stumbled across it as they were exploring the local area and visiting the Roman remains nearby.
The LYC Museum and Art Gallery was many things, and in one way, this exhibition is actually an exploration of that. And one of the things we wanted to highlight and focus on was the fact that this was a world made by Li, but with friends, with many people. The LYC was also a place that was open to the community at large. It had a children's art room, which was open and available for children of all ages. There was a kitchen that was for use, so people could come and make themselves tea. One of our most beloved photographs is an archival photo of Li with a tray of his self-made flapjacks, let's call them, sort of inviting people in. And I think that idea of hospitality, that place where avant-garde artistic practice, children's artwork, but also rug-making workshops, poetry reading, doll-making sessions, all took place at the same time, I think is just a window into that world, that there was no distinction between these activities.
The cosmic point for Li was really at the very philosophical heart of his whole practice. He said himself it was the beginning and end of everything. And I think you can see how that played out across the objects that he made himself, through to the texts that he wrote, and the things that he did in life. The cosmic point really flowed across all of his practice and indeed all of his career. In the Making New Forms display that we have at Westcourt Gallery in Jesus College, you can see the cosmic point and how that played out in his ink works. It could be the smallest dot on a piece of paper, and he follows that idea across a scroll or across a page. He also made hanging discs, these circular forms, which are often magnetic, and they often have these circular shapes across them, and the cosmic point is evoked through those structures. I think we could even describe the LYC Museum itself as a cosmic point. It was a place that sort of an energy radiated out from, and it pulled people into its orbit too. So it really was this kind of idea that I think connected all parts of Lee's practice as a maker and an organiser. Space, time, life for Lee, I think, was more than a motto. It was a way of trying to explain what he was seeking to achieve at the LYC Museum and Art Gallery. I think in some ways that importance of a physical space for people to create community, a nodal point, a gathering place, the idea that everyone needs time to do things, but also that idea of a conceptual space, that he was thinking of the everyday time, but I think also the time of the universe, something that's more than ourselves.
These three words are sort of high form of abstraction. And I think in a typical embodiment of Lee's practice, they allow multiple meanings. Lee often talked about this idea of a search for space and freedom. That's what we believe attracted him to the Cumbrian landscape. But that space also came at a time of the late 60s, and when you juxtapose space and time, you get into ideas of the cosmic that Lee was also exploring. This was the time of the Big Bang Theory. Our imagination of what the universe was very much part of Lee's thinking.
For me, a work that stands out is by the artist Winifred Nicholson. And it's a work that probably isn't that well known, even by fans of Winifred Nicholson's art. It's called Consciousness, and it was made in 1980, which is quite late in her own career. And I describe this as Winifred Nicholson's own cosmic point. It's got a force of its own that both sort of pulls you in, and you can feel the colours pulsating outwards, sort of pushing beyond the canvas and the frame. Throughout her life, she was a constant experimenter, and for her, colour had an important power on the viewer. It had its own kind of mystical force that she was interested in investigating. So I think when she met Lee, her neighbour, in the village of Banks in Cumbria, they had a certain kind of relationship through their own art making. They sort of understood each other. Both were interested in this idea of the cosmic energy of the universe, and Winifred Nicholson often described her art as trying to push beyond the gap, which we can't see, that art had this power to transport the viewer and the artist from the everyday into these kind of more universal or unseen realms of the universe. And I think for her, she saw something in Lee's work that she recognised, and Lee recognised something in Winifred Nicholson's work. And there, that friendship through their art practice, I think, really blossomed. So I think Consciousness, for me, is Winifred Nicholson's own cosmic point.
There are many legacies to Lee's project, and particularly for artists practicing today. We've invited 3 artists to make new works for this exhibition: Aaron Tan, Grace Diritu, and Xiaowei Sai, each one of whom has a different relationship to Lee and a different investment in his practice. And you'll see in the different spaces how they draw out things like care, spirituality, domesticity, offering and giving. One of the works that I'm particularly happy that we have here is by Anna Brownstead, who is an artist who's local to Cambridge and who has been working with community groups to devise a new version of a drawing machine that Lee had in his children's room at the LYC. And this is a machine that you can try out in our research space and that produces the kinds of drawings of cosmic shapes and wonderful forms that really are just the result of physics. And Anna has been kind of road testing this machine with different groups and making the object out of found materials in a spirit that she sees very close to Lee's own project.
We've been really thinking about the legacies and impact of Li Yuan-chia's practice on the histories of British art. What does it mean for an artist to come to Britain in the 1960s and stay until his death in the 1990s and have a really fundamental impact on practice? And I think we can see those legacies operating in different ways, and it's not a case of straightforward influence on aesthetic forms. I think it's more than that, and I think a lot of the artists we've been working with have been thinking about how Lee structured a culture of hospitality and generosity. And for example, Aaron Tan, one of the artists we're working with, has made a kitchen cabinet, which really speaks to Lee's own setup at the LYC, the kitchen that he opened up and offered refreshment to visitors. The artist Xiaowei Sai, who we have worked with in collaboration with Wysing Art Centre on a residency there, has made these small vessels, ceramic bowls, which she wants visitors to the exhibition to put offerings into. So again, this idea that art doesn't just exist on its own, but is a dialogue, a way of interacting with the artist and the viewer, whether that's the tiniest of dots, a large hanging disc, or a small vessel which is open for an offering.
This exhibition is at Kettle's Yard because I think myself and my co-curators saw lots of parallels and connections between the LYC Museum and Art Gallery and Kettle's Yard. We thought that Lee and Jim and Helen Eade had a shared investment in hospitality and in being a friend to artists, which is how Jim described himself. There are also significant differences in the legacies of Jim and Helen Eade and Li Yuan-chia and Kettle's Yard and the LYC Museum and Art Gallery. Because while we can stand in the space of the Kettle's Yard house, preserved as it is, as Jim left it, we cannot visit the LYC and see where Lee lived and worked. We can't retrace those exhibitions. So we have to think about why that might be. And that might lead us into questions about what it means to be an immigrant in Britain. It might also pose questions about the North and the South, as well as the kinds of art that we value historically.